All right, this is the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. We're recording this on Sunday, April 19th. Doing it a little early this week. We just because of the time that we were able to get Dr. Lucas joining us, friend of the podcast, serves as a ringside physician, also trains in jiu-jitsu. So we wanted to get a true pros take that's in the medical field on what's going on with moving forward with combat sports, the pros and the cons of doing it. Dr. Lewis, how are you, sir?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
So one of the things, obviously, folks are concerned with as we near May 9th and the UFC's insistent on moving forward and stuff. And I know you served as a ringside physician for their events and stuff. If you could just from your point of view, like what do you see as positives and negatives of them trying to move forward in the sport the way that they are during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends on exactly what their plans for moving forward are, and those seem to be pretty unclear. They had talked about this mysterious fight island that may or may not still be a possibility, and then it turned out they are actually planning on having an event at Tachi Palace, which is not too far away from some major metropolitan areas, so that probably wasn't well thought out. And I think, as Matt has pointed out before, they picked the wrong state to test the government in because, Newsom had been pretty clear that he didn't want large gatherings to be present, where some other states, Florida in particular, now seem to be a little bit more positive in that direction. They're still having WWE events. So I think that the UFC has a chance of getting this done, but they have to be able to do a couple of things. So the first would be they've got to find a regulatory body that's willing to let this happen in the area they regulate, and they've got to have a well thought out and a well thought out plan, and a plan that they can describe well about how they're going to keep the people who are participating in the event as safe as possible, what sort of testing, if any, they're going to do beforehand, and then what their plans are for the other people who need to be there. The WWE has been successful in having events, but they don't need quite as many people around the athletes for the WWE as they typically do for a UFC event. You don't have the corners, the number of physicians, the number of trainers, and all that kind of stuff that they have for a UFC event. So that's going to be their big stumbling block, is trying to figure out who really needs to be there, and how they're going to be able to do everything they need to do to assure the regulatory bodies that they're doing this as safe as possible.
If they were to come to South Carolina, would that be something that you would be interested in working, or would you, if you had the option, would you withhold from being a part of that right now?
So, I mean, if they came to South Carolina, as long as they satisfied the first condition that we talked about, they had a decent plan for how they were going to try to keep everybody safe. In particular, if they planned on having it in an arena without fans and just doing it for broadcast, and were to do not necessarily coronavirus testing, but just, I would probably be happy with symptom testing, proving that everybody that's there has their temperature taken every day for 3 or 4 days leading up to the event. And as they come into the arena, I think that the danger to the folks participating would be relatively small then. So I'd be willing to participate, but with one major caveat. As you probably saw, the Association of Ringside Physicians had came out and said that they don't think fight sports should be happening now. And as long as the physician bodies that, like the AAP or the American Academy of Internal Medicine or anything like that, and the Association of Ringside Physicians would fit in that category as well, as long as they are not in support of events moving on, I think there'd be pretty high likelihood that any physician who took part in an event in that sort of a setting would be sanctioned somehow. I like fight sports as much as the next guy, but if the brains that are really thinking about this from an objective manner think that it's a bad idea, and they say so, then I wouldn't participate under those circumstances.
You mentioned the Association of Ringside Physicians. I saw that I think it was Eric McCracken that runs the Combat Sports Law blog.
Yep.
He said that they canceled some event that they had coming up soon. Did you? Is that kind of like an indication as to where we're headed and what we should and shouldn't be doing?
They canceled their event, for the same reason that most, like the AAP and the other major physician organizations that I either am a member of or follow, have all canceled their events, and most hospital systems have actually asked their physicians not to travel outside the immediate area where they work for any reason, and certainly not for the quote unquote CME, the continuing medical education, because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're going to, like, if the Association of Ringside Physicians has their meeting, say it was scheduled for next week in Las Vegas, if 50 doctors from all over the country meet and they sit in one room, they're going to be shaking hands, and, there's no way to social distance through that. And if it turns out that somebody has coronavirus, now that means that pretty much everybody who's in that room is going to have to quarantine. It's going to be a big deal. And in the other medical specialties, it's an even more important thing. I mean, there's some medical specialties that are not that big, like pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. There's probably only 100 or so people that do that across the country. If you get a bunch of those people in the same place at the same time right now, and somebody tests positive or the coronavirus makes an unwelcome opinion, it's going to change medical care for quite a while. So I think the fact that they canceled their meeting is definitely indicative that they don't think that group gatherings is a great idea right now. But as you've seen just in the popular media, the models are changing day by day. So people's opinions about what is medically safe and what isn't is changing very rapidly as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my thing is, I mean, from a totally uneducated standpoint, just watching, like you say, what we see in the media and talking to people. Do you think that, I mean, I have a hard time in my head reasoning how having an event, whether it's golf, tennis, obviously bigger, when you have a bunch of players, like a football would be different because all of a sudden you've got 100 people at minimum basically involved. But like a MMA fight, a boxing match, how can that be any dangerous than the fact that I'm being like tunneled basically into the only grocery store within like a 2-mile radius of my house? I feel like when I go there, there's 150 people in a grocery store, whereas you could basically run an MMA event with probably like 15.
Yeah, and I've heard that argument a lot, both for MMA events and then also people who want to open their BJJ or striking gym back open. They're like, well, we only have 15 people to train here. I go to the grocery store and there's 150 people there. But the counter argument to that, it's not that the actual event itself is more dangerous, because you're right, numbers are numbers. If you put and you would hope that if they did have a UFC event, so they did it here in South Carolina in a closed arena, and there's 150 people there, and they physically space out relatively well, your actual numbers of exposures during that event is probably lower than it would be if you go to the grocery store to get milk and eggs. The counter argument is you need to go to the grocery store to get milk and eggs, whether you have the UFC event or not. So adding in one more exposure just adds up. It's just like the big thing around here has been the home improvement stores. I don't know if you have this in your areas, but they've been labeled as essential businesses because they sell stuff that people actually need. They also sell things that people don't necessarily need. And if you drive by Home Depot or Lowe's the past couple of weeks, their parking lots have been literally overflowing with people. So people have been, raising a lot of alarm about, hey, how come they can do that, but I can't go to my office with 5 people? How come I can't do this? How come I can't do this other thing? How come I can't go to the gym? And that's the general idea, is that the idea of having only essential businesses open is those are things that people have to do. And then if they're doing other stuff on top of that, it's just raising their exposure. So in short, I would agree with your general idea that it's not more dangerous per se to have a UFC event than it is to go to the grocery store or go grab takeout from the Chick-fil-A with the, line around the corner. It's just the cumulative effects. And I think the thing that's changed, at least right where we are in South Carolina, is the numbers have changed pretty significantly, and the forecast models have changed pretty significantly, even just in the past 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Such that it seems pretty clear that here in South Carolina, we're over at least the initial peak. We've come nowhere close to overwhelming the medical system. I mean, all the hospitals, including the hospital system I work at, are well below their normals, much less anywhere near surge capacity. So that's what's leading people to be a little bit more optimistic about getting things open. And now hospitals around us, including our system, are starting to do elective procedures again. The governor opened up boat ramps again yesterday. They're planning on opening other businesses, retail shops on Tuesday. And it looks like they're aiming at very early May, and certainly by early June, kind of being as back to as close as possible to business as usual. So as those sort of numbers take off, I think you'll see some regulatory bodies be a little bit more optimistic about the possibilities of having an MMA event.
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like, I mean, I use my own governor as an example. He's kind of waiting to see what everyone else does. So it looks like that's probably like you said, depending on who's running what, that's probably the take some people are going to take. But as far as like you got a lot of armchair, and I always mess up this word, so excuse me if I mess it up right now. But you have a lot of armchair epidemiologists. That have their own takes on as far as like, you know, how the virus has always been around, or how it's going to run itself out, and you know, or you know, this whole thing about herd immunity and things like that. What you as a medical professional, as a doctor that's served as a ringside physician, how do you respond to that when you see it? Is it scoffable, or what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny and sad at the same time, and it's just sort of a social media phenomenon. As you know, if you look at like the MMA sites, there's tons of people who have never even thought about training in any way, shape, or form, but yet have tons of technical advice to give people on how they should be doing their jiu-jitsu, how they should be striking. And the same thing happens in medicine. There's people that don't, you know, the last thing they knew about biology was something they learned when they were in high school, but they're willing to debate people that have spent literally their entire lives learning about a particular topic. So yeah, I've been very surprised the number of Facebook people I follow that were epidemiologists that I never knew. And you know, that may come in handy moving in the future. And then the thing that's been most surprising about that, or I guess I shouldn't say most surprising, but that's been most frustrating, is seeing a lot of people who have self-contradictory positions. You know, they're saying that this has been around forever, but yet no one really has it, but yet they think that herd immunity exists because there's such a large portion of people that are asymptomatic. And it's like the math on that doesn't, you know, work out really well. The issue though is that we don't know as much about this as we do some other things. You know, people, the comparisons to the flu are particularly frustrating, but they get used. But we know a lot about the flu. We know where the flu typically comes from. We know the patterns of how it goes around the world. We know the communities that it typically affects the worst. And more importantly, we know how to treat it, and we know how to decrease its transmission. Where with this, we know very little about it. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that they didn't even know that it was a coronavirus. I mean, that wasn't, you know, eons ago in time. It was within the last calendar year. And now they know it's a coronavirus. There's people working on a vaccine for it. There's been a lot of treatments postulated, none that have really turned out to be the panacea they were hoping for yet. But and that is reflected in the models. You know, you go back a week or two ago, people were still talking about, in the best case scenario, we're going to have 100 to 200,000 Americans die from this.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's a week later, and I'm not aware of any model that's currently predicting that. Unfortunately, those models can change in both directions, but the more and more we learn about this and we see the effects that we've had with the social distancing, even in places like near you, Ed, where, you know, New York City was overwhelmed not too long ago, that situation is rapidly improving. And the concern about the lack of surge capacity hasn't really arisen many other places. New York City, a little bit in a hospital in Detroit, but once you move outside of those big urban centers, most hospitals are well beneath that. So as we get more and more information, the models get more and more accurate, people will start feeling a little bit more confident in the numbers they're spouting. And I think you'll see the expert opinions from actual experts start coalescing towards a common idea.
You bring up the vaccine, and I got into a conversation with a relative last night about that. And he's extremely optimistic that there's going to be a vaccine. And while I am happy to hear the optimistic talk about it, I also kind of tend to be the devil's advocate in a lot of situations. And I'm not so, a lot of situations. I like to kind of get angles from all sides, but what, as a doctor, what's your perspective? What do you think the odds of us really finding a vaccine for this are? I just feel like we have a ton of stuff where we don't have vaccines for. We don't have an AIDS vaccine. We don't have a common cold vaccine. We don't have really have a flu vaccine. We have shots that you can hit some strains if they guess it. But I mean, is it over optimistic to think that we're actually going to come up with a vaccine that's going to wipe this out?
Yeah, it's really hard to answer that. So I mean, it's entirely possible, and there's a couple of advantages we have towards developing a vaccine to this coronavirus compared to some other things. Particularly, people always mention the common cold, but the issue with the common cold is that there's literally hundreds or probably thousands of different viruses. Some of them are coronaviruses and rhinoviruses and adenoviruses that cause the common cold. So they can't make a single vaccine that's going to hit all of those. Where it looks like coronavirus has some pretty stable structural points that would be good targets for a vaccine. But there's a bunch of steps between identifying places that are good targets for a vaccine and actually having a vaccine that both works and is safe. My biggest concern is, so far, there's still not great confidence in the medical community that getting an infection with this particular coronavirus leads to any long-term lasting immunity. So if getting an infection with the coronavirus doesn't lead to lasting immunity, then it's exceedingly unlikely they're going to come up with a vaccine that works for it. And then even if it turns out that you do get long-term immunity from this, they still have to develop a vaccine that's both safe and effective, and it takes a while to get that figured out. They worked on vaccines for coronaviruses with both SARS and the Middle East respiratory syndrome that came out, and those stopped not because they couldn't do it, but because the problem went away. So funding dried up, where it doesn't seem like funding drying up for this is very likely to happen. So I think we may see a vaccine at some point, but it's not likely to be real soon. And that's been the other thing that's been interesting about the conversations you hear online or in forums is, there's the typical subset of people who are just anti-vaccine, and you hear about, Bill Gates is going to come up with a vaccine that's going to actually kill you or put a microchip in your arm to track you and things like that. And people are arguing about things that don't even exist yet. I have said that right now, having discussions, second order discussions about whether you would take a coronavirus vaccine is kind of like asking, would you accept a unicorn as a birthday gift next year? Because it's not going to happen at this point in time. So when we can argue all about the pros and cons of having a 150-pound horned animal running around your backyard, but the fact of the matter is it's all theoretical at this point. So until a particular group comes out and says, hey, we've got this vaccine that we think will work and we're going to start moving it into actual human trials, it's really hard to have any great insight as to whether it's something that I'd be willing to take myself or whether I'd recommend it to patients or how likely it is to work.
So yeah. Well, real quick, you got to be looking forward to then my documentary on Ed and doing his Unicorn King.
Unicorn King. Oh yeah. I just took me a minute to get there. That's I don't that's the worst thing ever. But anyway, I prefer to do a documentary on how horrible my hair is going to be if my barber don't open soon. But one of the things that Matt mentioned that made me think of it, because you see the UFC planning on moving forward with May 9th and all these Fight Island and being able to string together a bunch of events, but they still haven't even gotten the okay yet from the athletic commission or anything like that. So jumping into trying to cycle out events so soon. I mean, we've seen fighters in the past on fight day or day of the weigh-ins, guys get flu-like symptoms and stuff like that. Right now during a pandemic, if something like that happens, that could potentially shut down a whole event and any fighters and staff associated with it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's the other issue with having an event is the training that needs to happen beforehand. We're not talking about golf where, people can just kind of fly in, get their clubs there and go out on a course and play. They got to be in tip top shape, which means they have to be training with somebody. I mean, I'm sure you saw what happened to Gio Martinez out in California. He had a couple guys over to his academy to film some techniques, and they left and they got a summons from the police for violating the stay-at-home order. So it's going to be really hard to figure out how they can get people someplace where they can train and have their skills where they need to be, get their weight where it needs to be, and be in the kind of cardio they need to have to be able to fight successfully. So there's a lot of steps that need to take place before they're going to be able to pull off an event.
Out here Ed's got the population in New York and New Jersey. My big population group, well, still a couple hours away, is Las Vegas. And I guess one of the most depressing things for me is reading some of the stuff that they're talking about this virus is going to do to the future, basically, of Las Vegas, and a lot of things. I mean, the gambling is one thing. They're talking about there'll never be buffets again. I don't eat the buffets in Vegas a lot, but definitely a
Yeah.
staple, something that, it's in movies. It's known, the Las Vegas food buffet. They're saying those will never be around again. Um, they're talking about, 6 feet between people at events, uh, and they're saying no sporting events. And I mean, the governor of California, who's made a lot of big, you know, guesses on stuff, is saying no sporting events for like 18 months with crowds. I mean, from a doctor's perspective, is that real? I mean, are we really looking at almost 2 years of not being able to go to a sporting event?
This is definitely a guess as well, because we're back kind of talking about unicorns because we don't know what
Yeah.
the future holds. But one thing that has been a constant throughout time is that people have a short memory overall. And this is not the first pandemic. And thank God, it looks like it's going to be nowhere near the worst. And yet, every single time, very quickly after the pandemic threat went away, people very quickly went back to their old way of living. I mean, I don't think you're going to suddenly see a mass migration from cities back to people living on little communal farms in small groups and never traveling out. I think it's highly unlikely you're going to see sporting events. I would not be at all surprised to see the buffets in Vegas open not too long after, if not at the same time, that Vegas kind of gets back to their normal. Because people just, those things exist because people like them and want to do them. And I think the idea that there's going to be years where there's no sports, particularly not any sports anywhere, and no crowds of any size is almost inconceivable. And look what happened in Florida. They had people on spring break were packing the beaches just like normal at the beginning of the pandemic. And then they opened up some beaches the other day and they flew a news helicopter over one of the beaches like 15 minutes after it opened. And there was already a couple hundred, if not a couple thousand people back on the beach. So I don't think you're going to see a huge change in people's habits. There'll be some people who change their habits, but I don't think it's going to be the majority of society.
Do you think because I know the last time we had you on, you had talked about how when you do get tapped to serve as ringside physician for events that it's not as frequent. It's not a hot spot for MMA or combat sports. Do you think that's going to change as far as, because if you like, obviously New York and New Jersey, we're probably not going to have anything for a long time, maybe even a year. But do you think? I mean, is it kind of like a good sign for states like yours in your area, where it's like, okay, if things are really going to get going, do you want that to happen? Obviously you want it to happen for the fighters and stuff as a fan, but I mean, there's a downside to it too, isn't there?
There could be. I think that our state has done a good job so far of making somewhat rational decisions. Our governor was relatively slow to shut everything down and didn't really do it until there was a pretty clear consensus of the actual epidemiologists around the country that we had to enact some sort of social distancing or there was going to be major problems. And then he's already, as soon as the numbers look like the peak has passed and that things weren't going to be a huge burden on the hospital system, is already sort of making steps towards opening back up. So I think it's perfectly likely that you'll see some events take place in states that have not typically been hotspots, because where the hotspots are also happen to be places that have the demographics that make coronavirus be a much bigger issue. And if you're going to be relying mostly on pay-per-view, because I think that the first couple of events, no matter where they are going to end up being empty arenas with no actual live spectators there. Doesn't matter where you hold them. You can hold it in Siberia and you can stream from there just as well as you could stream from Las Vegas. You don't need a big arena. You just need a place that's willing to help you out. So I think you'll see the UFC run towards the states that are opening up most quickly. So I think Florida in particular, since they've had WWE events and continue to have them, is very likely going to be a place you see the UFC pop up very soon, at least stateside. And then foreign countries, there's both pros and cons. The pros are some of the foreign countries aren't going to have the same kind of social distancing requirements that exist in the U.S., and their regulatory bodies may be easier to work with. But then there's the issue of a lot of the fighters still live in the U.S., and the certain states and possibly the federal government may not be real thrilled about having Americans flying from the U.S. to some sporting event someplace, or more importantly, coming back from the sporting event into the United States. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because, like, down the road, if you look at, I mean, I remember growing up, they used to call Madison Square Garden the mecca of boxing, and then Las Vegas became the capital, fight town capital of the world. So I'm wondering if there's just, over time, if that's going to change depending on who can start holding events, the old-fashioned way first.
Yeah, and I think it actually might. And again, it's all speculation, but I think that in the near term, even if there's not a medical reason for people to avoid crowds, there's going to be a significant portion of the population, probably not that significant portion of the fight fan population, since it seems like, looking online, the majority of fight fans would go to a huge event right now if they could. But I think you'll see portions of the population that aren't wanting to go to live venues in the near future. So we may see a trend more towards events that stream well, as opposed to having them in huge arenas that can hold large numbers of people, at least short term.
I think that's probably really likely. I guess my it's to me, it almost seems like it'll be hard to do it piecemeal as far as opening up states. That's where I kind of am a little strange, because I've already got friends that are going, hey, if Arizona opens up golf courses, we're going to Arizona. I feel like that'll be the same case, like if, where I'm at, if they open up Del Mar Beach, if LA's in complete shutdown, everybody from the hot zones in LA are just going to come down to Del Mar and go to the beach. If they have MMA events in South Carolina or Washington, DC, let's say, you're just going to get a ton of people from the hot zones in New York, I would think, traveling down the coast, even if all the way down to Florida. So is there, I mean, obviously this is all unicorn stuff again, but what is there any, unless, I mean, how low do these numbers do you think they have to get for this to become something where it doesn't have to, we're not so worried about it? I mean, or is it something that we're just always going to worry about until we have a vaccine?
Yeah. So, I'm reticent to say that we need to wait until there's a vaccine, because I'm still not confident that a vaccine is coming. And if it is, it's probably at least a year or so away. I mean, I think even Bill Gates said that he's thinking it's like 1.7 years away or something like that. So, I mean, it's going to be a while. The people seem to have moved the goalposts a little bit about what social distancing was about. Everybody started social distancing, and the hashtag was flatten the curve. The whole idea was not that social distancing was going to make less people get coronavirus. It was just going to make it so that less people got coronavirus all at the same time, so we wouldn't overwhelm the hospitals. Well, it seems like in most places, with a couple of notable exceptions, we've accomplished that. So that's why some states are moving towards opening things back up. And as the number of coronavirus cases go up, that will hopefully, again, assuming that if you get coronavirus, you're then immune to it, will make the R number, the R naught number of the number of people that each person with a coronavirus case infects go down. And as that number goes down, the chance of there being a sudden surge of sick patients goes down. So as that number looks like it's going down, and we see states that have hospital systems that have plenty of surge capacity left, people, I think, will start becoming more and more comfortable with going out in groups, and you'll see things start trending back to normal in those states. And as that starts happening, so I'll use South Carolina, since it seems like we're on the fast track in that direction. If a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, South Carolina is opening back up and we don't see a huge resurgence in cases, you'll start seeing more and more pressure in the states that are a little bit slower to open back up to do the same thing, because people will be like, hey, look, South Carolina and North Dakota and Florida and these other states are doing it, not having a problem. Why are we still not being able to do what we wanted to do as far as going to work and having events and that kind of thing?
See, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because obviously being in the medical field, you probably have a better idea of where to look for these forecasts and resources and things like that. Because, I mean, and this is me from a personal perspective. Every time I talk to my mom, she thinks the world is ending, listening to I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom in the headlines, and I know there's numbers that back that up, but it looks like as far as like a rate of recovery and things like that don't get focused on that much. So as someone like yourself that's a medical professional, where do you go? I mean, like I had the John Hopkins thing up on this podcast a couple of episodes ago, and that's one that I go to. I kind of really don't watch the news as far as updates on the pandemic. I just look at that because I'm like, I don't want to hear, reasons for me to go out and buy toilet paper and things like that. So
Right.
what do you use? Where do you go?
So a couple of places. I mean, I'm most concerned about what's going on locally and really regionally. So sort of in the western North Carolina and most of South Carolina, and get those numbers from the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. Our hospital system actually has a virtual meeting a couple times a day where all the medical directors of the different departments listen in on kind of what the numbers look like, what the testing looks like, how many tests are being done, what percentage of those tests are positive. Is there any trend they see in the testing? Like, do they see a lot of young people getting it?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular nursing home or a particular hospital or a particular zip code where there seems like there's a problem? And then what the hospital vacancy rates are like. How many ICU beds are available? How many ventilators are available? Are we discharging more COVID patients than we're admitting? That kind of stuff. And those numbers are probably available to the general public, but it would be relatively locally. So I would look in your local paper for reports from whatever your state's Department of Health and Environmental Control happens to be called. And then for the bigger picture, the CDC has fairly reliable numbers. Now, of course, there's conspiracy theories that, if you die in a car accident, they're going to call that a coronavirus death. I'm sure you've seen that stuff floating around on Facebook, but without those kind of concerns withstanding, the numbers that the CDC gathers are probably the most reliable for the country. And then you may be aware of the website. It's Worldometers or something like that, or World Odometer. It's WORLDOMETERS. And it's just a running tally of not just in the United States, but across the world, the number of known coronavirus cases, the number of people that are currently infected versus people who've either died or who've recovered. And they have a number there of how many tests have been done, and it's by country. And then in some of the countries, you can zoom down to individual region. And those numbers, it's not immediately clear to me exactly how they're amassing them, but they're from public health authorities. So they're relatively reliable. And they're the ones, when you see numbers get announced from national news media, they seem to reflect what that particular website says. So I think that they're using the same database.
Yeah, just kind of jump to an MMA side of stuff here. First of all, I saw on Facebook that UFC Contender Series competitor Carl Reed lost his grandmother recently in the last couple of days. So just want to send the best out to Carl Reed, former guest of the show. Best out to him and his family. And obviously tough times. I'm not sure if it had I don't think it had anything to do with the coronavirus, but
no, it was not coronavirus related, but it was very sad.
That's neither here nor there. It's just best out to his family. Now you obviously have close relations to some of the MMA world in the South Carolina part of the world over there, or the country. Have you had any contact with those guys, whether it's Carl or Steven or any? Is there any kind of frustration that's starting to build up with these guys as far as looking for a fight or being so stagnant?
I haven't heard anybody, since all the promotions are shut down, I haven't heard anybody complaining about not being able to find a fight. And the people that I know locally all have some way to train. They're either, like Steven, they literally own a gym, so he's able to train there. He trains with his dad. So, I mean, you can't get much safer than that because you literally live with a guy. So going to hit pads with him doesn't increase the risk for either person. And Carl, be like doing a lot of running, swimming, stuff like that. There's stuff that they're doing outside the gym to try to stay in shape. I've heard more complaints from gym owners and people who run promotions as a significant portion of their income. They're more concerned about, what do we do? Do we shutter the promotion to try to avoid bleeding money and maybe try to sell off our cage or get rid of our training equipment? Well, there's still a huge market for it, and if you want to sell used sports equipment, boy, this is a great time to do it because you can't buy it, from the typical retailers. So that people are having to make some really difficult decisions. And unfortunately, we've already lost regionally. I know of at least one BJJ gym in North Carolina, actually in Charlotte, that decided that they weren't going to be able to survive this and closed their gym. There's been a couple of other more distant affiliates that I've heard rumors of that have shut their doors, and there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of others that I just don't know about that have decided that they can't do this. And unfortunately, it's going to probably be hardest for people who used to have a BJJ gym as their second job, and then sometime in the relatively recent past decided they were going to try to do it full time. And this just hit them at that time where they're not making a whole lot of money to begin with, and they don't have a job to fall back on. There's just no reserve financially to be able to make it through this. So I think those are the people that are the biggest risk of having a serious problem.
Yeah. No, we had John Burke on, and we kind of talked about that too. I mean, like a lot of folks are struggling. Actually, it's funny you mentioned the thing about getting the summons. I know a local guy that got one because he kept trying during the beginning of this, and that was kind of the cue to my instructor that he was like, "Whoa!" He's like, "Yeah, we're not going to screw around." So we're all just waiting it out. Talking about the MMA side of things. I mean, this is random. I mean, because we're coming close to the end of time here, but with the matchup of Justin Gaethje and Tony Ferguson, we got to get a prediction. I mean, let's throw all the numbers and dangers aside. If the fight happens, who do you got, Dr. Lucas?
So I think the most important thing about that matchup is it's going to help us figure out which half of the Ferguson Khabib is actually cursed, or whether it's just the two of them together. And unfortunately, I think that Tony is probably the half that's most cursed, because I mean, he did ruin his knee tripping over a wire. That's definitely kind of curse worthy.
Yeah.
So if this fight does actually happen, I like Tony in this fight. I think that he's probably going to end up winning the fight, probably in the later rounds.
One thing that I have to say, it the fact that they're still going to try to have that fight happen soon, I feel like it benefits Justin Gaethje because now he's got a little more time to be ready versus the short notice that he was going to have. And then, usually when you hear somebody with a leg injury like that, I feel like he's going to target his legs. I mean, obviously he targets everyone's legs, but I feel like he's more susceptible to losing that way too. But I mean, I'm a Justin Gaethje fan, so you can't go by me. But yeah. I don't know. You got anything on that, Matt? I know we kind of.
I'm just not so sold. We're going to see an event until I mean, I can't get excited for it. I didn't think the last one was going to go down. Said that for weeks on here.
Yeah.
We hoped it would because we were looking for some entertainment. But I think all our hearts and our brains kind of knew that it wasn't really going to go down. I just don't see this. I thought the announcement of the event, hours after the other one got canceled. To me, it just seems like it's Dana White and the UFC trying to keep their name in the news. And if you just keep making events and all of a sudden, the cards get more stacked and more loaded with all this talent, comes out that the talent's not even alerted that they're supposed to be fighting. I don't think contracts are signed for a lot of the fights. I mean, I don't know this for fact, but you see reports of people not aware that they were even fighting, and then you see people agreeing to fights after it was announced and that kind of stuff. So I mean, common sense tells you that this is just somebody reaching into a hat and pulling names out and doing it. I do like the angle that this could possibly lead to less weight cutting. And I think it could open up the door to that. I saw Dana White for some reason say that catchweight fights don't mean as much. I mean, I don't fall into that category. To me, if they fight 5 pounds over what they normally would fight after, as long as they're at the same weight, it's two of the same weighted dudes fighting each other. So I don't know, but I just can't get excited about it. I think Florida could do it. I said I think on the show last week that it wasn't just WWE that was considered essential. It was basically kind of there was a whole sports category to the way that I guess that rule was written. So UFC could have, in theory, been in Florida for having events 3 times a week for the last month, but they weren't aware of that or just didn't choose to go that route. So, but I just can't get excited about it. I mean, I want to see the fight, but until I hear until it starts, I guess. And then the whole pay-per-view thing, I'm having a hard time. I said that on the show too, trying to explain to people that are hungry for a fight how to order right now through ESPN Plus, and if they don't have, like I said, my uncle doesn't have a smart TV, so he has to get a Fire Stick, and then, all of a sudden it becomes $150 to order a pay-per-view.
Yeah, who's
We
got
have
that
no,
money?
Yeah.
I'd rather.
And you have to be an engineer to do it. So.
Yeah, and if we're looking at a card like this, they're throwing out this card. To me, that card could be split up to about 3 nights of entertainment. Why don't we just put it on ESPN on a Monday, Thursday, Saturday or something, and have five fight cards over 3 nights of the week or something. It seems to me ESPN could make plenty of money with that. So I don't know, but until I hear somebody like Jon say the fights are going down and this is real, I just can't believe it.
So to sort of piggyback over a couple of things Matt said, I agree. I think that it's unlikely that event is going to happen as planned. But Dana White is a pretty smart guy and is a really good, I think, businessman. And I think that's one of the reasons why he keeps throwing this out. Like you said, it's free advertising because ESPN's talking about this is going to happen. It keeps people interested. And just as importantly, with the way the contracts are written between the UFC and WME and ESPN, it's going to be helpful when it comes time to the end of the year and they haven't done as many pay-per-views as they're supposed to have done, for Dana White to be able to say, hey, look, we tried everything possible. We tried this island. We tried doing it on Indian land. And you guys were the ones that came to us and said, you can't do it. So now you can't enforce that financial part of the contract.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a no-lose situation for him. If he's watching, and I assume, you guys are so popular, it's pretty much a given that Dana White probably watches your podcast religiously, right?
Yeah.
I would encourage him to consider stepping back from the sport aspect of the the rankings and things like that for a period of time, and just get some fights on pay-per-view, which is probably going to be easier to do. So I would use the same methodology they've used for the Ultimate Fighter, is consider them to be exhibitions. So they're not going to actually be on people's events, but take some mid-tier guys that want some work and get 2 of them out to Las Vegas and let them train at the Performance Institute for a week, and then have them fight, and then send them home, and then have 2 other people come and have them fight at the end, and then send them home. And that'd greatly reduce the number of people that need to be available for that. I mean, he's got in-house medical staff. Dr. Davidson is right there in Las Vegas. He's got all the pieces, parts he would need to have that happen. And then once you've got 3 or 4 of those fights together, then bingo, you've got a little pay-per-view you can put out on ESPN. I would, of course, advocate for free, but that's probably not going to happen. But for some sort of, some sort of content of something that's new that people can tune in for and keep people's interest up. And I think that kind of thing would be very easy to do. And once they've done that for a couple, 3 weeks or even a month, and no one has gotten coronavirus from it, it'd be an easy way for him to then start leaning on his political friends in Nevada, probably in particular, and say, hey, look, this has gone fine, so why don't we have an actual live event at the Performance Institute, and then kind of come back in that direction.
I feel like Ed's heard that before, that idea.
Yeah.
I think you might have heard that through this podcast. I think like last week I said the exact same thing. Use the exhibition format. It doesn't have to go public record. Get younger fighters who it doesn't necessarily matter if it's on their pro record or not. They're just looking for some action. No, I mean, I think that was the way to do it all along. I think this idea of having 15 Hall of Famers on a card is optimistic at best. But I got one more question that's not MMA related, but it's kind of a hot topic around here as far as the virus again. From a doctor, tell me what the deal is with masks. I was always under the impression that the mask was to be worn by the person that has the symptoms and is sick, and it basically it helps them from projecting their fluids or the virus from them out to other people. That when I would go to urgent care or whatever, that was kind of always the situation. We were told that was the case, and then we don't need to wear masks. And now it's basically mandatory everywhere I go in my county out here that I have it on. What is the actual medical stance for wearing masks in a time like this?
So, masks there's basically 3 different types of masks, and it kind of depends which one you have on. So there's the Mac Daddy of masks, the N95 or M99 masks that are the ones that they usually have the two straps that are usually elastic, and they're typically the harder ones to breathe through because the filtering is much greater. And those are the ones that, like, if I had to go into a room with a patient that was known to have coronavirus, that would be part of the PPE for that, would be wearing an N95 mask. So those can help protect the person wearing them from inhaling the droplets from somebody sneezing or coughing or even talking to you. Now, out in the community, unless you're right face to face with somebody when they sneeze or cough, or you're really close to them, you're more likely to pick up the virus by touching something like a keypad or a railing or a shopping cart handle that somebody that has coronavirus has aerosolized near, and then you're going to pick it up from the contact. And then when you touch your face or touch your nose, you then infect yourself. So the N95 mask out in public won't protect you from that, but having everybody else wearing a mask makes it less likely that they're contaminating surfaces heavily with their aerosol. So that's where the sort of the regular medical masks come in, is they're very good at preventing people from aerosolizing their sneezes or aerosolizing when they talk to you. And then the last are sort of the homemade masks, and they're not necessarily homemade, but fabric masks. So, like, Origin Maine has buffs that you can buy that are meant to be coronavirus masks, or lots of parents or lots of people, including my mom, have made some fabric masks that you wear. And those are entirely to prevent you from accidentally seeding other people with the virus by coughing, sneezing, and things like that. But you may have seen, there's a couple of videos floating around of people spraying aerosols through the fabric masks, and quite a bit of the aerosol makes it through, because, I mean, you can hold the mask up to light and see that there's little gaps between the fabric. So they're not perfect, but the whole idea is to try to reduce the amount of aerosol that you're producing, because the less that is sitting on surfaces, the less likely to somebody else will pick it up. So the idea behind the regulations or the suggestion, so here in South Carolina, is just a suggestion. You don't have to wear a mask when you're out in public. But a lot of people, myself included, I think most medical people, are, just to try to model the quote unquote best practices. The idea behind that is, if I contract coronavirus and don't have any symptoms, if I'm out getting coffee, going to the grocery store, seeing patients in the office without a mask on, it's way more likely that I'm going to contaminate my environment, my coworkers, and my patients than it is if I'm wearing a mask.
Yeah, so I mean, it's and here in the Northeast in Jersey, you have to wear one if you're going inside of like any supermarket or any place where people are going to be at. It seems like it's more of a, and it's hard. It seems like it's asking people to be considerate of your fellow man, and that's super rare here in New Jersey. So, I mean, I actually do it because I care about my parents and other people and stuff like that. So I keep one in my pocket. If I go in the store, I put it on, just to kind of not, I happen to be one of the rarities that are considerate of other people, but not a popular train of thought.
That's been my biggest concern about this whole pandemic since, I mean, the original, when we first heard that it sort of escaped, for lack of a better term, escaped from China and started spreading to other countries, I thought, oh my God, this is going to decimate my patient population of kids that have congenital heart disease, and in particular NICU graduates. And then when we learned that it seems like, for reasons that we don't fully understand, kids are kind of protected from this, my biggest concern shifted to, I hope I don't get it and accidentally infect my parents or the parents or grandparents of one of my kids, because I am seeing patients in the office like normal, and wearing the mask is the best thing you can do to try to minimize that. And then a lot of places, some employers and most hospital systems, including ours, have started doing things to reduce the number of people who are in the facility overall. So, like, if one of you all went to be seen in one of our clinics, they would take your temperature at the door and then give you a mask as long as you're not febrile. But your wife or your mom or dad or your buddy or whoever that would normally accompany to your visit can't come with you. And with kids, they're only allowing one adult to accompany to their visits, to try to cut down on the number of people who are coming into the facility overall. And they're doing the same thing with employees. When I go into work every morning, they check my temperature, they ask you the questions, have you been to any endemic areas recently, you have a cough, that kind of thing. And then they give us a mask, and we're expected to wear the mask whenever we're in common areas to try to cut down on the potential transmission from employee to employee or healthcare worker to healthcare worker, and then more importantly, in my eyes, from a healthcare worker to a potentially at-risk person.
Yeah, and we're winding down here, but I got to ask because it hits me a little bit personal. But you mentioned the NICU situation and young children. Anybody who's followed me knows that my niece is kind of the poster girl for NICU miracles. She has obviously lung issues that'll be with her for her whole life. You wouldn't know because she's a little maniac, but it's how has that worked? Is there a lot of numbers or stats that show that kids that maybe are vulnerable have been uh, around the virus to that
So
and it hasn't affected them?
it's not immediately clear that there's been kids that are potentially vulnerable that have been affected but not, or have been infected but not significantly affected. But there's a couple statistics that I do know. One of them is around the world, there has, at least as of yesterday, which is the last time I looked, there was no case reports of any children with congenital heart disease succumbing to coronavirus, which is miraculous because a lot of our patients have wildly low oxygen saturations at rest because their cardiac anatomy is so abnormal. So I thought for sure they would be prone. And then the NICU folks, as of last week when I talked to them, said they had not seen a lot of alarm from other countries or within the US of NICUs or NICU graduates being overly affected. But there's a couple of potential reasons for that. So as you probably know from your niece, NICU parents usually take the same precautions that we're advising for everybody for their NICU babies for the first year or two of their life because of this thing called respiratory syncytial virus, which is a very common virus in the community that's devastating for babies that were particularly born premature or babies that have congenital heart disease. So a lot of our NICU graduates, they have even on their car seat, they have a little stop sign that says "Stop, don't touch me," and stay certain number of feet away. Parents are very good about putting some sort of buff over the car seat when they're in medical settings, and they'll ask family members who come to their house, are you sick? Have you had a fever? Make sure you wash your hands. They won't let them hold the baby. So they already do all the sort of social distancing things. So it's probably a combination of NICU parents already doing the social distancing and infection control practices we would want them to do for coronavirus because of the existence of RSV. And there's probably something intrinsic to the coronavirus that makes young kids in particular less prone to have problems with it.
All right. I mean, that's a lot to take in, but thanks. I really do appreciate you making time to come on. If you have any last minute shout outs or plugs that you want to do before Matt takes us out, the floor is yours, Doc Lucas.
No, I think I'm good. Just like you kind of hinted out a second ago, the social distancing and wearing a mask out in public isn't necessarily to help you, it's to help other people. So, take those steps seriously and don't be the reason why you kill somebody else's grandma.
Well, there it is right there. Yeah, maybe we'll get lucky and a unicorn will be invented out of this China next, and we can go from there. But all right, fans can follow us at Combat Hour on Twitter, Coast to Coast Combat Hour on Instagram, myself at MMA Hawk 21 on Twitter and Instagram. Follow Ed at Carbazol on Twitter and Carbeerzol on Instagram. Dr. Jon Lucas, thank you for joining us. Ed, always a good time, and look forward to next week.
Peace, y'all.
See you later.